Good evening to all of you, and I say again hello to everyone, and welcome to this webinar on impact of pandemic on children's education. This event is organized by the CSHR Webinar Committee as a part of our series of events organized in commemoration of the 30th anniversary or 30 years of successful journey in the field of human rights education and research. So today's webinar topic is impact of pandemic on children's education. So why we talk about education and children's education per se? Education is fundamental to help children develop their full potential, and there should be schools for every child, taking into account their age and needs and their future. Education is the most important tool to combat poverty because educated children are less likely to end up in poverty. Without education, we cannot properly understand the world around us and fight for changes that could make into something better. Education helps us build opinions and have critical views on things in life. Education is the knowledge. Knowledge is power. Getting an education means that you are going to school and you are learning. So therefore, education is a right for children. It is a right that also helps enjoy other rights too. Education is a tool of empowerment, a means to promote children's rights, and can provide individuals with necessary skills to have the best possible life. We talk about quality of education, education rights, and equal opportunity of education, and so on. But early this year, an unprecedented way, 1.4 billion students were shut out of their pre-primary, primary and secondary schools in more than 190 countries in an effort to slow the spread of the coronavirus named as COVID-19. COVID-related school closure affected children unequally, as not all children had the opportunities, tools, and devices or access needed to keep on learning during pandemic. Decades of slow but steady progress of education was noted in the early 2020, but the pandemic persisted. Schools in some countries were reopened for in-person or on-site teaching, but in some other places have been waves of school opening only to close again, that we have seen in many parts of our region. An estimated 90% of the world school-age children have had their education disrupted by this pandemic. So therefore, now we look for this opportunity and we will have to measure and evaluate the impact on education due to this pandemic situation. Fine. So I'm happy to welcome all of you on behalf of the Center for Study of Human Rights and the seminar and the webinar committee of the Center for Study of Human Rights. Today, we have invited expertise in the field of education and in the field of child rights and the field of how to evaluate the impact of pandemic on children's education. So experts will share their experts' knowledge with us. Now we will listen to the experts. At this point, I'm very happy to introduce our featured speakers today. Firstly, I would like to introduce first speaker, Professor Vasantha Senivaratna, Professor in Public and International Law, Head of the Department of Public and International Law, Faculty of Law, University of Colombo, Director, Center for the Study of Human Rights, University of Colombo. She is an author of many titles in international law and human rights. Recently, she was elected as the Vice President for South Asia of the Executive Council of the Asian Society of International Law. Professor Vasanta is going to talk on the topic of right to children's education, a basic overview of that. Then I'm so happy to introduce our second speaker, Professor Harendra De Silva. He is well-known educationist and as well as an expert in the field. He is going to talk about health issues and mental health of children and contemporary studies and contemporary challenges. He no need a broad introduction. He is well known in all parts of the world. Professor Harendra De Silva is a pediatrician with a special interest on child protection, but he was also teaching medical students for almost more than 40 years and still continue to do so. Nowadays, he is engaged in Zoom lectures and other activities. His lecture would be based on education of children from medical standpoint as well as impact on mental and physical health. Although it's a very vast area, we have limited his speech up to 20 to 30 minutes due to the time constraints of this webinar format. So we will ask more questions during the question and answer session from Professor Harendra De Silva. Now I wish to introduce the third speaker, Ms. Milani Salpitikorala. She is going to talk about access to education, about homeschooling and online learning. She's going to share some examples with us. And she's an attorney at law of the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka since 2012, founder and executive director of Child Protection Force Guaranteed Limited, a civil society organization in operation since 2017. Child Protection Force provides a legal representation for children within the justice system, and she is a law graduate from University of London and has her master's in law specializing in human rights from Queen's Mary University of London. She also takes part in educating state sector and the general public on child protection, gender-based violence, and promotes mental health awareness. So with this introduction, I invite the first speaker, Professor Vasanta Seneviratne, to begin our today's webinar on impact of pandemic on children's education. Over to you, madam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hakim, for your very generous introduction of me as well as the other speakers. As the director of the Center for the Study of Human Rights, I have a special obligation to welcome all of you very warmly to this online event, particularly Professor Vidyajyoti Harendra De Silva. Dear Professor, thank you very much for accepting our kind invitation, as well as my long-time friend, Ms. Milani Salpitikorala, attorney at law and child rights activist. So both of you agreeing to attend to this webinar to flag your views, I consider as a great privilege and honor to the Center for the Study of Human Rights. Well, moving to the task given to me, I thought to open the webinar by giving an overview about the right to education of children and how that right to education is affected by the global pandemic called COVID-19. Now we are in 2021. Still we call it the designated name COVID-19, and now we have passed 2020, 2021, and country was under several lockdowns, as well as the country was open, but the schools remain to be closed. So with that, we have to pay our particular attention to the impact of this global pandemic, as well as the closure of the schools and how the children's right to education is affected. If I briefly mention about the international standards on rights of children, we know that is the UN Convention on Rights of Children of 1989. So the convention is premised on very great principles, and children's best interest of children is paramount significance. Even without moving to such international heights, even at local level or at the home front, we know best thing should be given to children because they are the future, they are more vulnerable, they are dependent, and they need our support for their growth and groom to be a full-fledged adult and to be a good citizen to any social context. Now it is our obligation to see how this role of children to be groomed and developed by the society at large, particularly by the state parties who have been members to the UN Child Rights Convention, and whether that particular responsibility has been duly discharged by Sri Lanka as well as elsewhere during this pandemic, with particular emphasis on the theme of today, that is the right to education. If I take your attention to the relevant provisions of the Child Rights Convention very briefly, Article 28 as well as 29 stipulate the responsibility of the state parties to ensure the protection and promotion of the right to education of children. I wish to draw your attention particularly to Article 29, which states that state parties agree that the education of the child shall be directed to the development of the child's personality, talents, and mental as well as physical abilities to their fullest potential. So with the closure of the schools and the children has not been having the opportunities to have their formal education as it has been the case in previous years before the pandemic occurred. Whether this development of children's personality, talents, and mental and physical abilities have become a reality, and what kind of a responsibility the state parties, including that of Sri Lanka, owe towards the children and their development of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and for the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations as well as other human rights yardsticks. So we understand the fact with the closure of the schools, anyway in any society, particularly low income and middle income countries like Sri Lanka, that we know there are a lot of opportunity gaps. I am not talking about the elders or other categories of vulnerable people, but I am now talking about the children, right? We understand anyway, even under normal circumstances, the past forgotten normalcy, not the new normalcy I'm talking, the opportunity gap was there. You know, the urban-rural divide, even the able and the disabled, the students or the children, as well as the wealthy and poor students. So then all these opportunity gaps were persistent, but those were exacerbated by the pandemic. So therefore, we have to look at fresh to find out new strategies as well as to find out solutions and remedies to the long-lasting, persistent problems as well. Now take for an example, what has happened? I'm talking not only as an educationist or a university professor, but I'm talking as a mother who has children who go to school and who have been staying at home and who are limited just in front of a small device and with or without any support by the parents or the teachers, that they are all alone and now they are struggling and striving to have their education. So this problem has affected to a preschool child as well as to a child at a very high school level, primary, middle school, secondary, tertiary, including even postgraduate level students. But we are talking about the underage children that who need their parents or the teachers' support to study, but we understand that private schools, maybe the students are better off than their peers in the government schools. We find that the school provides an education not only to gain knowledge. The education is a very broader spectrum that embraces the skill development, character building, attitude development, socialization. So many and so much multitudinal aspects are expected. So where is this childhood education experience? We still remember our school days that we had our company with the children. We were talking to each other, playing with each other. We had the interaction with the teachers and the school administrators, playing, participating in other extracurricular activities. I think that just giving online education using a small device coming through internet or Google Classrooms, I don't think that is a full-fledged education that children are going. Don't say it is totally a failure, the online education, because now we are so much used to this hybrid modes on site, online, as well as totally coming through to the child's mind and the home with our learning packages. But the problem is how many children are benefited by those resource-related access to education. In Colombo or in suburbs that we know, the parents who can afford to their child's education, they can purchase internet facilities, the devices, and other access, the bandwidth, and all this could be made to a certain degree. But that is not the case. I'll tell you that I remember that I don't say at which point that I experienced this. One student from, that a very historic village called Me Murray, the child who is not a small child but a grown-up university undergraduate, who climbed to a enormous tree and joined the mobile to some of us and said, "This is how I am going to have my education." So this symbolizes the problems of these children who are living far away with less facilities and all these things. And when we are talking about the need to, in rural areas, we know the children go to school and they are given some kind of food security, some of the facilities, glass of milk or some of the biscuits and all these things. So those also matter a lot for a child to study. But staying at home for some children, even such feeding facilities may not be assured. So we know the economic and income levels of parents are severely affected these days. So with that, the household difficulties, economic and other social problems, domestic violence, and children are affected by all these things. So right to education does not mean that opening the schools or having some online platform open. So if we try to flag some of the issues, I'm not going to give a very broad explanation about, but still I think we have not been able to, as a country, to introduce full-fledged radio educational programs or TV educational programs for children who are unable to access to online and internet facilities using or providing by the certain educational providers. Also, any mobile services like a mobile book library or functioning of village level, any other resourcefulness of providing the facilities, those are still a dream for our children to achieve. So I hope that our very erudite speakers, Professor Harendra De Silva and Ms. Milan, with a lot of experience working with children and identifying their problems, will give us very strong foundational thoughts for the to express their views, the comments, the questions, and so on. Thank you very much, the CSHR family, for having this webinar. We are proud of you. Always it has been the case for having this very important social activism, human rights activism, and trying to inculcate values for a better future for this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vasantha. Professor Vasantha focused on the right to education as a fundamental right, fundamental human rights. So therefore, every individual, irrespective of race, gender, nationality, ethnic or social origin, they are entitled for education. And also, Professor Vasantha focused more on the equality and equal accessibility of education and the state obligation in providing these educational opportunities. So with this remark, I call Ajra, member of CSHR webinar team, to it's a time for a token of appreciation for our guest speaker by the director of CSHR. Ajra, is over to you now.
Thank you very much, sir. Something to say about the evolution and successful journey about CSHR. The CSHR was established that took place in the country in the late 1980s. Successful journey of CSHR is not a sprint. It is a marathon that one needs to keep on running and achieve one milestone after the other. And believe me, all the employees of the center are the super runners. Every employee requires a person with abundance of positive vibe and confidence to get things done perfectly with great directions. As a proof of that, the two eyes of CSHR are Honorable Director and the respectable Deputy Director. They are playing an essential part towards the successful journey of CSHR. We are extremely grateful for that. They have set an exemplary standard for all of us with their work ethics and their dedication. On behalf of CSHR, I convey the best 30th anniversary wishes. In commemoration of 30 years anniversary celebration, it's our utmost pride and gratitude to warmly welcome our distinguished panelists to do the webinar. To express our gratitude for accepting our invitation amidst their hectic schedule, we warmly welcome Professor Vasantha Seneviratne to give away the virtual token of appreciation to Professor Harendra De Silva, the nation's best pediatrician.
Thank you, Ajra, dear sir. This is a virtual appreciation for your very kind participation and agreeing to deliver your thoughts and to share your thoughts with us. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Vasantha. Now we move on to the second session of the webinar. Now I cordially invite Professor Harendra De Silva to speak about health issues and mental health issues of children in the contemporary world. So, sir, it's over to you, please.
Let me first thank the Center for Human Rights for having invited me. I must first say that I'm not a mental health specialist, except for the fact that my experience in child rights and child abuse has given me some views on that. And of course, I've been an educator for medical students for a huge period, long period. Of course, when you talk of education, it is not only through knowledge from books that we acquire from books, but also learning skills and attitudes which does not necessarily come from books or Zoom. And of course, the ultimate aim of education, a lot of people don't, some people don't even know this, is to achieve a behavior change in an individual as well as in the community. So I think it's important to understand that. The behavior change is what is important for a doctor, is the behavior change in terms of not only the knowledge, but being able to examine somebody, speak to people, convey messages, do surgery. So it's the behavior change that we achieve through education. Unfortunately, lockdowns do not give opportunities to skills development and attitudinal change. Now, children, however, may develop certain skills, such as browsing internet is a skill that they will develop, but not necessarily attitudes. Then programming skills or cooking and things like that may be possible. But what is more important would be the interpersonal skills that would children would suffer, especially aspects of success and failure, especially through sports and play. I will mention that again. The home environment should be conducive with the correct leadership attitudes of parents and elders who focus on correct behavior change, especially when there is Zoom sessions going on. The home environment could facilitate the attitudinal change there. Then human being actually starts learning from birth. From the time we are born, we are learning. The baby listens not only to the mother's speech, but also looks at her facial expressions, movements of facial muscles and movement of lips. And thus, when a child learns to speak, he or she does not only listen, but also takes cues from the mother's facial muscles and reads the lips of the mother, as well as her attention, her love and care are things that makes the child learn certain things, not necessarily from books or Zoom. So the mother or other people at home, communication would not be comprehended properly when we wear facial masks. Maybe the eye movements will be seen, but the facial expressions may not be seen. So I think it's important that although masks are important, I'm not saying it's not important, masks are important. It is crucial that people do not wear masks at home unless somebody at home is infected or in a crowd, especially where there is a child. If there is a crowd and there's a child, then wearing a mask is okay, but not at normal times. I think these are things that a lot of people don't understand, because speech in a child is learned. It's the first part of learning, first part of education is learned by looking at facial expressions and also the lip reading. When you talk about Zoom, I think this is mainly focused on Zoom. I think it is a two-dimensional medium. It's not a three-dimensional medium, and could impart knowledge to a large number of students. That's an advantage. One speaker can speak to 500 people, students, if necessary. But still, it is not personalized. And there is little interaction with students, especially when numbers are huge. As mentioned before, skills development and attitude, I'll be repeating this, attitudes and skills, because that's the most important part of education, would be difficult. Then the rapport between student and teacher is minimal. I mean, the students come to the stage of even worshipping the teachers because of the interpersonal relationship and the rapport that the child has developed with the teacher. But when it comes to Zoom, it looks more inanimate object, a two-dimensional object, and that is not felt. And in time to come, we will not see where people worship the teachers. Of course, I have seen children who are on Zoom, they leave the class without the teacher noticing. So there is no control, there is no discipline. So discipline is also part of education. Especially, it's part of education and behavior change, especially self-discipline. I'm not talking about discipline which is punitive, which we were taught when we were small. Not punitive discipline, but self-discipline should be taught. but it is only possible in a classroom setting. Unless the parents who are at the other end of the Zoom class is also listening and they also impart some aspects of this self-discipline that is there. So I think it's important when it comes to discipline, because everybody thinks about corporal punishment when you talk about discipline. No, totally against corporal punishment. It should not happen. But there are ways of disciplining children, which is important, especially self-discipline. Then successes and failure. I mentioned this before, success and failure in practice. We succeed in exams, we fail in exams. Sometimes it's relative. We are not first, but we are second or third or whatever. We don't lose, we are not necessarily so. But we have to learn successes and failures in practice. And that is not very possible in this. And then we need to have coping mechanisms that has to be taught to a child, and the resilience that has to be coming to the child when it comes to success and failure. A child who fails should not be crying for 24 hours. He should be able to pick up and say, okay, I'm going to do that next time, whatever, right? And so these are usually through interactive situations, which includes play and sports, because when we play or we take part in a sport, we don't always win, we lose, but we learn from the losing. And that is also part of education. And to be able to cope with that is more important. Then I think a lot of us don't talk about win-win situations. We don't talk about win-win situations. I think it's very important, where we don't always win. The other side also wins and we also win. And that is important when negotiating with somebody else. And which is also important in coexistence in a multi-racial, multi-religious facility. We don't talk about it. We always talk about winning on our side, but that is not important. That is important in terms of not winning, but win-win situations. Peace building at the early stage of learning is critical. Then the availability, I think this was mentioned earlier, the availability, affordability, and access to online learning devices and Wi-Fi divides society into have and have-nots, right? I'm not echoing a Marxist version, but it is true, basically. But have and have-nots, which gives an edge to the rich rather than the able. But at the same time, the able is not necessarily the people who need to learn. Everybody else should learn. So, but however, this gives a major discrimination in society, and the Article 28 of the Convention of the Rights of Child is totally challenged by this notion because the Wi-Fi access, the type of learning device that you have, and all that may be so different in different places. And then learning opportunities to the differently able. I think a lot of people don't address. I thought I will address this issue because I know I have so many patients who are differently able, and I know the difficulties they have, and I personally know of certain situations. I personally know where differently able will be marginalized in a major way. Those with hearing impairment, for example, would have difficulty, especially if sign language is not available, or if the camera is not focused on the teacher's face properly, because the child will learn hear partly through maybe an earphone or a cochlear implant or whatever, but would also look at the teacher's face and the lips and lip read in the whole situation of learning, which is not properly distinct, because we don't cater to those children. These are not specially designed Zoom sessions for such disabled children. But remember, there is a sizable proportion of students who will have these disabilities. The visually impaired, on the other hand, would also have similar issues if you can't use Braille online, which is not possible. And then the biggest impact would be on another big of children who need absolute interaction in the teaching and their education, where one-to-one attention. But the autistic spectrum disorder or the ASD, and then would be ADHD or attention deficit hyperactive disorder, where the child cannot concentrate. You know, autistic spectrum disorder, they don't have interactive communication with the other person. So Zoom is impossible. Person to person is also not easy, but it is needed. ADHD is where the child will be running about all over the place and you may not be able to keep the child in one place listening. But in a classroom, one-to-one session, some of those things can be addressed. Then dyslexia and dysgraphia are two things which are very, very common things. A lot of children are dyslexic, and there are other learning disorders as well. And it constitutes a large proportion of the population. And these are the children who get beaten in school for not being able to study or write because the child is dyslexic, right? And of course, these children would be left behind in this system that we are following now. We take precautions or we take certain measures to correct that. And the majority of them will have specific problem or a combination of problems. For example, autistic child will have ADHD, would be dyslexic, and so on and so forth. And therefore, each child, you have to cater to each child differently, and they need specific interventions. So each child will have need certain interventions, and Zoom is not going to cater to any of those issues unless we have specifically designed small group classes, especially for these children, and with a parent or a guide on the other side who could listen to the teacher and then guide the child in the learning process. So now this is, again, it's a huge proportion of children. It will come to thousands of children in the spectrum, and they will be left behind, leading to a lot of problems. Then, of course, the irony of Zoom and screen time, which is important to understand. On one hand, we restrict screen time for children to 1 hour. That's the standard thing that we have been saying all this time, or maybe 2 hours. And Zoom schoolwork is going on for several hours. So that is also screen time. So where do we compromise? Too much screen time is known to be associated with inactivity or in one place, and which leads to obesity, irregular sleep, which either you're keeping up at night or you're getting dreams and other things of what you have seen in your playing games or whatever. And then there will be issues of learning during daytime. And of course, there will be increased snacking with increase with this sort of thing, which again leads to obesity. Of course, there will be behavioral problems. They may have emotional issues, having too much of screen time, and they will have social attention problems. Then there will be impaired academic performance. Students, they have shown that students who have TVs or other screens in their bedrooms perform worse on tests than those children who do not have TVs or screens in their bedroom. So that has been proven long before the COVID. Of course, violence. Those children who are exposed to a lot of violence on screen can be desensitized to violence. For them, maybe killing is nothing. And there are also online sessions, and there is also the deep dark web, which causes lots of issues, huge issues, which is prevalent, which deals in cryptocurrency and all sorts of things. And also, so a lot of people don't know about the dark web, but children go into these things. There is online gaming that happens, which can also lead to suicidal issues. And the blue whale game, for example, can lead to a lot of problems. So there's desensitization to violence. And then less time for play as a result of that, and excessive screen time leaves less time for active creative play. Then therefore the Canadian and US guidelines have been developed for children and youth, and they recommend just 2 hours or less hours of screen time per day, but they do not count the schoolwork time. Maybe school work is 4 hours or 5 hours. That is left out. In addition to that, they give 1 or 2 hours screen time that is recommended. Of course, provided, now that screen time is also given, provided they have adequate sleep and at least 1 hour of physical activity. Of course, remember, no screen for those less than 2 years. Of course, less time for maybe over 2 years, not incessant, long drawn out things. Now, lockdowns causes stress, causes domestic violence and other issues. And this is not education, but it is somewhat attached to it. When there is stress, both on the parents and the child, there is maybe due to lack of recreation in the father or mother, economic issues, job security again, and then children, the lack of recreation, they are depressed, not having friends to play with, and then they can be overactive, they'll be shouting, jumping up and down and creating a bit of a row at home. But that, plus sometimes very often alcohol. You don't need alcohol, but which also leads to hoarding of alcohol. And then domestic violence with your spouse. I'm not talking only about male violence. We can also talk about female violence sometimes, which is rare. But anyway, that's another topic to discuss. And then with that, there will be child abuse. And in child abuse, mainly emotional abuse is the most common, where a child is denigrated, emotionally put down, trampled emotionally. And then there is physical abuse, slapping, hitting. Recently, there was apparently a death of a child where the father got angry about increased screen time and attacked the child, and the child died. And then, of course, sexual abuse, because we are living in a closed environment. Even the neighbors don't know whether we exist or not. So in that sort of situation is very conducive for sexual abuse, which leads to further violence. A child who's traumatized try to emulate the violence that he has faced, and he becomes more violent. And then there is also depression, and there may be suicidal attempts as well. Again, this leads to affects the education and behavior, depression, and then the vicious cycle. The more violent the child is, the more likely there is going to be stress on the parents, and which goes on and on. Then this may not be related to education or health even, but it's related to health to some extent. We have seen irrational hoarding of food. That is because we are insecure whether we will have food for the next lockdown. But then there are expiry dates for the food we hoard. And then the time, we have excess time on our hand, we are at home, and we have time for internet. We can experiment recipes. And then we have high carbohydrate and fats in our diets that we go on internet and make. Of course, there is also, in addition, depression and inactivity, which also leads to overeating, which leads, all these things causes obesity. Then this may be a problem in the upper and middle class thing, where there are not much of economic issues, but they can order online and so on and so forth as well. And then, of course, it may be the opposite, where they are malnourished in the poorer classes. However, there is research to be done. We don't know anything that has been documented properly. But this is just an observation. The middle class families where children have become obese, from my own observations. Of course, with obesity, there's bullying, depression, which also affects learning. Again, it becomes a vicious cycle as well. Now, this is my slide. We will talk about germs and sanitizers. The environment has lots of millions and millions of microbes or germs. And then there are good germs and bad germs, right? So the skin microbiome is another microbiome. On our skin, we have a lot of germs, and some of them are good, and they are useful in maintaining our skin, the health of our skin. Some may be bad. And then we have more deeper, the intestinal microbiome. The intestinal microbiome is very important in diseases, especially NCD or things like diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease, and so on. It has been shown long before the lockdown, long before the COVID, that the intestinal microbiome is critical for in other diseases other than infective diseases. So we know now that sanitizers kill both good and bad germs, which affects the intestinal microbiome. We kill the skin microbiome, the good ones as well as the bad ones, and then there's an increased risk of obesity and NCD. And then the hygiene hypothesis is where it is known that intestinal microbiome or microbiome itself is important in preventing allergies to foods and drugs and things like that. So by killing intestinal microbiome, there is at least a theoretical risk that the allergies can be more. And also there are theoretical postulates that antibiotic sensitivities to antibiotics will also be altered due to the overuse of sanitizers. So again, increased risk of obesity and NCD, going back to the same thing of obesity, bullying, depression, and learning issues. Finally, sanitizers are important, but obsessive and paranoid overuse should be avoided. And soap and water is preferred to sanitizers. So sanitizers we use when we don't have access to soap and water or when it's inconvenient. And so that is what is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So, you highlighted on health and medical issues of children due to online and screen learning, and you shared contemporary stress, problems, and challenges. So those you explained causes and side effects from a medical standpoint, as well as impact on mental and physical health. So thank you, sir, sharing with us your expertise. And also I have an announcement to the audience. So if you have any questions, you can share your questions with us through the chat box. Please type your questions and send to us. Then we can post the questions to the respective audience. And now I call. Yes, can I request the audience, please mute your microphones because someone's microphone is unmuted and echoing. Now is the time for CSHR team member. So now I'm going to invite the second speaker. Our third speaker, Ms. Milani Salpetikorola. She is going to talk about access to education, homeschooling, and online learning. She's going to share with us some examples. Before she starts her session, I wish to call a CSHR webinar team member to give away her online token of appreciation. Hajra is out here.
Thank you, sir. To express our gratitude for accepting our invitation, I warmly welcome the senior lecturer, the deputy director of the CSHR, Mr. A.M. Hakim, to give away the virtual token of
Right. Thank you.
appreciation.
Thank you.
Milani Salpetikorola, the founder and executive Executive Director of Tiger. Over to you.
Thank you, Ajila. Ms. Milani Salpetigorlo, please accept our online or virtual token of appreciation. Thank you, madam, for accepting our invitation and participating in our event.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
So, please, it's over to you. Please take the floor.
thank you for inviting me first, and it's an absolute honor to be on a panel with Professor Harendra and Ms. Vasantha. So thank you for that. When we're talking about access to education, I'm going to also go through a lot of examples while I speak as a child protection lawyer, as a child rights activist, and also a mother of two very young children who are online schooling right now as we speak. So I'm going to also take some examples that Ms. Vasantha was talking about. For example, when children go to school and they are given food in certain schools. So out of some of our cases also and my experience, I know children who go to school for this sole purpose is because they receive food from school. And not just that, when we're talking about child protection, as Professor Harendra also very clearly explained, during this pandemic, I think when the lockdown started in 2020 March and up to now, myself and the team here as a extremely small organization, we have received an overwhelming amount of cases, mostly of matters of domestic violence where the children have been involved, a lot of sexual violence against children, and more cyber violence, cyber harassment, cyber exploitation on children. Recently, I was also on a different panel, and there I heard somebody saying, books are of no use anymore. You have to let children explore the internet without boundaries. And this is something I was completely against because I know, being such a small organization and a person within the justice system, the amount of cyber exploitation that happens in Sri Lanka and children don't know. I'm going to start off with this morning's example. A client who came in today, she was 10 years old. She came in with her parents. And she's sitting for her Year 5 scholarship exam. The school is putting so much of pressure on the parents to get the children to study to sit this Year 5 scholarship exam. The parents had to go for a PCR test because the father works in India and he had to fly back. And the daughter said, "Don't leave me here, take me with you." But they said, "No, the teacher has asked you to finish these papers by tomorrow morning, and you have to finish these by tomorrow morning." So they kept the mother's smartphone, the device at home, with the grandmother's house, which is about 10 feet away from their house. So she was at the grandmother's house doing these papers, told the grandmother, "I need to go toilet." So she went to her own home. And there are these construction workers nearby. A man came in, locked the door, tied up her hands, and she was subject to grave sexual abuse. I'm not directing this to the fault that there was so much pressure from school for the exams. But this was a situation where this child had to have access to that internet facility. And apparently, this man has been continuously calling this phone. So that means he was watching this child for a long time. He knew when not the parents are in and out, and that is when he came in to abuse his child. So this or access to not only the tabs and the internet that is a problem. When we're talking about access to education, it's also those children who live in the extremely rural communities who have to walk to school. I personally know a girl who has to walk for 1.5 hours to get to school. And she said, I got fed up of it. I gave up when I was 15 years old. At 16, I met a boy. At 17, here I am. Now I'm pregnant with my first child. And the boy is no longer there. So these are difficulties, clear example of a difficulty of access to education. She didn't want to walk that 1.5 hours and walk back that 1.5 hours. Something very close to home. My junior lawyer, she lives far away from Colombo. That's where her home is. She's already in Colombo. Her younger brother, they just got a smartphone recently, and there are about 4 or 5 young boys around that community who come in for classes. So the other children who don't have access to a device, of course, is in that whole inferiority complex, and also the fact that I don't have a device. There are so many teachers who have reached out to me asking whether we help them with phones. So these are the teachers. And you see the frustration in teachers, the older ones. I see the frustration in the teachers of my children, the older ones who can't, they're not used to this entire system. There was absolutely no training, there was no planning, and it's been 2 years now. And there are teachers who are not used to technology. I'm 35 years old. I'm not used to this yet properly. There are teachers who don't understand how to share the screen. So there is a teacher who is quite old, who is my daughter's teacher. She's a lovely lady, but she keeps a whiteboard behind her and she's, writing on the whiteboard. And some children are saying, Miss, your screen is blur, we can't see, we don't know what you're writing about. But at least these children have the luxury of having that online school. But I personally know at least I think 50% of our cases that we handle here, the children have been doing nothing for the past 2 years. Schools have been doing nothing. And I feel there is no point in blaming the schools. There's no point in blaming anyone actually. I think it is an entire systematic change where we could have prioritized the education of our children. Priority number 1 should have been health, and how the entire health system was going to be streamlined for this pandemic. And also priority number 2 should have been access to education. And when we're talking access to education, we're talking about equal access opportunities. I'm sure all of us have seen, children walking over very scary, broken up bridges to get to school. So we have a child population below the age of 15. We have 5 million, close to 5.2 million children in Sri Lanka below the age of 14. So this is compulsory primary education for these children. But there is a massive percentage of this 5.2 million children that don't have access to school, that don't go to school. Also the children of, say, if I may use the word vulnerable children, children of drug abusers, children who don't have parents, who live in care institutions, and maybe some of the Western Province care institutions have provided some schooling and so on. But we have to also think about the rest of the country that don't have 3G or 4G signals, that don't have access to devices, and also the care institutions that don't have resources. I believe Colombo lives in a bubble, and a lot of people in Colombo really don't know what happens to children. And coming to good practices of other countries, for example, Canada being in the top list for their policies with regard to children, the first thing when they locked down their country, the first thing they did was they called the people living there, not only Canadians, but also immigrants. They called people who had children. They called every household and asked, how many children do you have? How many devices do you have? And at a point where you said, I have 2 children and 1 device, within the next 2 days, a device was delivered to their house for access to education for that second child. And I know how difficult it is. I always use my personal life as an example. I know how difficult it is for parents to also cope with this online education that is available to people who have that luxury of online education. As Professor Harendra so rightly said, the overuse of devices has caused a lot of anxiety-related psychological issues between children. And then the pressure from the schools for parents. I go home from work and I sit down, all I'm thinking of when I'm printing out is what do the parents who don't have printers do? They have to be standing in line in a communication shop getting printouts and pasting all these printouts. So it is an extremely difficult time for children mostly, and also for parents for going through this. I have seen mothers in these mothers groups and so on. I have seen mothers who have said, I'm going to break the device, thrash it, put it in the blender, and then go and kill myself. I've had people who have actually posted these on social media because of the pressure that they are going through. So a lot of mental health awareness. I don't know whether Sri Lanka is ready for this, but I suggest we start getting our guard up and start readying ourselves for this extreme need for mental health assistance that is going to come within the next few years. And Professor was also talking about the sides of the dark web. This has also been a massive issue within our the cases that we have received recently. We have had children coming here with cases while they're on Zoom classes, when unknown people are admitted into these chats, and they get to know them, they take screenshots of their faces and so on, and they find this is easily accessible on the internet. And where they have approached young children aged 12 and 13, sending them nude photographs and so on. And the second part of that is our law enforcement ready to handle this? Is our law enforcement educated enough to handle such issues? When we're talking about safety within the internet, I just wanted to put in there also the fact that there are a lot of groups. There is apparently an app called Telegram, which is something like WhatsApp, that has child sex trafficking rings. So where children are being shared in these groups, and then people talk about what they want to do, and they also find where these children are. They start grooming these children. So this is why, even if you have that access to online education, you have that luxury, that as parents, I believe all of us here are adults, and the message that we have to send out is, as parents, you have to monitor what your child is doing with the device, and very rightly so, as and how they handle the screen time for children. My 5-year-old had a headache, and I had to take him to this child eye center in Rajgiriya. And there's a lovely doctor there, who asked me what his screen time was and so on. So we have rules at home, so screen time is limited, but of course, sometimes it goes a little overboard when I have to work nights. At this point, they have, in this center, they had these ready-made, already there leaflets. That means there may be a lot of children coming in with eye issues due to screen time. So it spoke about people being, children being sent outside to play. It spoke about half an hour of sunlight. It spoke about all these things. So just like I said, just having that access is not what it is. It is a safety with devices. It is a safety for the emotional well-being of the children, and again, like Professor said, with regard to the games, now they get used to the online schooling, and most of them have unattended access to devices, and then they start exploring. And they, I think a 7-year-old can handle device way better than you and me, because they've born into this whole, I don't know what it's called, 4G, 5G world. It is a bit scary at this point. And when people who don't have devices and have been given access to devices later, now I think there was a talk about the previous government handing over tabs to A-level children, which I think is great at this given situation. But when you give someone a device and unattended access to the device, then you have to also teach them and guide them with the dangers of these devices. I have had in this same drawer of my office desk a device owned by a 12-year-old boy who has searched online of how to rape his sister. He's also a victim of abuse, but these are the dangers of unattended access to devices. So it is also, as much as people say that it has to be an equal access to education and equal setting around the country for devices and internet facilities and so on. It is also very important that adults are aware of the dangers of the use of the World Wide Web. So as you also may be knowing, Sri Lanka is a signatory to the ICSCR since 1980. But the thing is, now this actually says that every state is under obligation to provide free access to compulsory primary education for children. But as much as our constitution also talks about the right to education, it is not justiciable, as in we have a right to education, but I can't take anyone to court in a situation like this, right? So, but there have been some cases. I remember, I hope you remember the case of the young boy's mother, the little child's mother who had HIV. So in that particular situation, it was the court actually took into what the court spoke about was a procedural issue of education. So whether that child had an equal right to education just as the rest of the children. So these are the things that now, even though schools were forced to close, a lot of Colombo schools, a lot of the I would say the urban schools started online education, and these children had obviously be lucky enough to have their online education at least. But what about the rest of the population of children? I think out of the close to 6 to 7 million children in Sri Lanka, this percentage of children who actually had online schooling opportunities must be very, very small. I don't have the actual statistics, but it must be small because there's a massive population of children. I'm thinking about now, it says the total population of Nuwara district is 700,000 something. And 1/3 of that, about 250,000 are children. we have been to places within this Nuwara district. We have been to places that have absolutely at least 1 hour's access to the main road, leave alone phone signals and 4G signals. So what happens to these children? What happens to the estate children who have absolutely no access? So I think we, as much as the world is changing, and unfortunately we also have to adapt to that change. We may be in need of changing this whole exam-based education system. For example, there was previously a program called Think Equal that came for early childhood education. And I know this program because I have read every single word of these books because both my children were pilot students. And this program spoke about emotional intelligence. It spoke about, the entire program was about being respectful and loving Mother Nature. So I had my kids running to the beach and collecting plastic all the time. They still do because it was a seed planted in them at that age. It was about, empathy, loving animals. So this type of, I think we need to now start changing into this type of holistic education system. And this will also help children with this whole resilience, emotional resilience, because I have come across a lot of 20-year-olds. I would say that whole millennials, I think that's what they are called, the ones who are born in the 2000s, have absolutely no emotional resilience, at least the ones I have met. At serious emotional issues, they break down and it's very difficult to try to explain things to them. So I think I've gone extremely off topic as well, but it is very important that I put these out. So like I say, access to education, yes, everybody should have it, but we must talk about equal access to education. So not only during the pandemic, but always where all children, I think all of us adults have that great responsibility for all of our children. So if we can spread this awareness, if we can go out and talk and spread equal access to all children for education, I think, Mr. Hakim, I am done. And if there are any questions, I'm ready to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Rani. So thank you for sharing your first-hand experience from the real world. Yes, when we listen to those stories, we feel that there is an inequality in the society to access a right to education. And we feel that how are we going to face the future? So thank you for sharing those experiences with us. Now is time for question and answer session. I have requested the participants to post their questions in the chat box. The first couple of questions to Professor Harendra, sir.
Yes.
Yes. Participants, some participants have sent some questions about what kind of psychological issues need to be attended immediately among the school children in the pandemic time. And also there is a primary concern, soon after this lockdown is over, how are we going to treat the children? Are we going to change the norms of customary practices? So the questions over to you, sir.
Yeah, it's fairly vague, but maybe very wide, and I may not be able to answer all the questions or all the aspects of it. But
Okay.
I think it is one is that I don't think there is any magic answer to it. There is no silver bullet for this. I think what we need to understand is that the parents have to understand the issues concerned. So the parents have to learn about internet abuse or whatever. And then we...
Yes. Ms. Milani, there are more questions to you. Right. I start with one question. Do you think that the gap created within Sri Lanka in terms of access to education could be reduced. So if so, what is the responsibility or the whose responsibility is that? How this is going to address the sustainable development goals to achieve the goal number 5, that achieving equal right to education. So what's your response to this?
Mr. Hakim, one thing I have to say is I'm not a professional or this thing in education, but I personally think it is the responsibility of every adult citizen of Sri Lanka. Okay. It is the responsibility of government, yes, but who should pressurize the government? Every adult citizen of Sri Lanka. It is our responsibility to create that pressure. If that is what we want, if we want our children to be educated and have that equal opportunity to, as a final goal, obtain that sustainable development goal, yes, but isn't every parent's dream or need right now for education for their children? If that is the case, then talk about it, create that awareness and pressurize government. So there are a lot of ways in which this pressure can be created through the media. I believe media is one of the biggest problems for secondary victimization of children. Media can start putting out positive messages. One government channel, like for example, there are areas in Sri Lanka that don't have access to 4G or 3G or whatever the need is for internet, but they have access to Sri Lanka Rupavahini, the 1 or 2 government TV channels. Then why not have these segments for children who are at home on education? I mean, I think these were already proposed, but there seems to be no need to prioritize these. Switzerland, Canada, their policies for children is in the top list. The child policies are in the top list because they have identified that the future of the country will depend on the protection of their children. So protection of children, a big part of that is also education, holistic education, I believe. So I think the personal view is what I just said.
Thank you. Again, there are more questions coming to you, Ms. Milani. Ma'am, can't we create any system or apps to control and monitor the screen time and the online program using the university students like Morotova University? They're asking some technological suspension or a control. So you have any response?
I am probably the most low-tech 35-year-old that you can come across. My technology knowledge is zero, so I'm so sorry I can't answer that question.
Right. And there's another question to you. So do we have any possibilities to change the policies for in order to include the children who don't have internet access or children are from most vulnerable condition to ensure right to access, equal access to right to education, something?
So again, like I said, what I said previously, it is the responsibility of each of us to start creating that pressure. And then education departments within every province to create that pressure. And, you know, as parents, we have that right to go and question, okay, now what are we going to do? How are these children going to have that right to education? What is the plan? Can you show us? This can even become a public interest litigation, because this is a massive part of the public that has this problem. And most probably, I feel a Supreme Court public interest litigation application can be probably filed and tell the government, look, we need a plan. What is the plan?
Right. And can you please explain how the COVID-19 has influenced social development of children who are in their early childhood? So that's a question.
It says has improved. Social.
Yes. Influence has influenced, yes.
So, I mean, it would depend on the social background of children as well, right? For example, children who live in very small apartment-wise places, and the parents had no choice but to give them access to devices, right? I also have our psychologist sitting right in front of me here, and she has come across so many children who have come in since the last year. We have had so many children who have come in here since the last year with various issues of anxiety. And these may come from arguments or domestic violence within the home environment. These may come from excess use of devices. So a lot of social behavior in the education.
What kind of psychological issues need to be attended immediately among the school children in pandemic time, during pandemic? And also the second question is, after pandemic, when the schools are open, what are the priority issues, psychological issues to be attended by the teachers and other stakeholders? Sir? There are two questions, sir. Thank you.
I think it's one of the problems that we have is that, as I said, these are not things because we don't have the infrastructure. We don't have an infrastructure to address psychological issues. For example, there are school counselors, but whether they are specially trained for this type of thing, we don't know. We really don't know exactly what, at least I don't know, how the school counselors could come in, whether they are trained specifically for issues of the pandemic. Because the time of training of these people, there was no pandemic, there was no Zoom, there was nothing like that. So they may not be specifically think. I think it is the government that has to address it. And also remember that we will have to have this child psychiatrist on board of this, where the child psychiatrist, because we don't have child psychologists except for in the private sector or in some of the universities, because the government of Sri Lanka has not recognized. I put the blame on the government on that. Not this government, right across, right from the beginning, has not recognized psychologists to be either board certified or something like that in terms of working in hospitals or schools or whatever. So it's not, psychologists are not in the harder, and therefore less children are wanting to do psychology as this thing. So I mean, it's something that has gone on for a long time. It's not working properly. So I know that things have to be addressed. As I said before, when I started, I'm not a psychologist. Now I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a child specialist, but I know a certain amount of psychology, partly because of my work on child abuse. And so I think we have to start even now, at least now. It is that, you see, we don't have access to the infrastructure of the school system. The school education ministry has to recognize these problems. Not only recognize the psychological issues, but also, as I said before, children who are marginalized because of certain learning disabilities, right? And they are not addressed, you see, because there may be classes in schools, I'm talking about real-time classes, which address children with various mental disabilities. And that is not optimal. Because a lot of the children who are very intelligent, right, may be put into these subnormal classes. I've seen so many instances where somebody is physically disabled is put into a subnormal class, and then they unlearn some of the things that they would have picked up from school, from home. So there are issues like that, and I think it's up to the government and especially the Ministry of Education. I'm not pointing fingers, but I think it has to be a dialogue where we identify the issues and also develop the infrastructure, and also to see how we can address this issue. I think from a short-term point of view, my personal opinion is that we can't be training psychologists overnight, no counselors overnight. So what we need to do is to have a core group of psychologists, right, especially the clinical psychologists, who will be able to evolve certain things
and not necessarily go on webinars because everybody, Rupani or Sirius or whatever company, medium, and address some of these issues, make people aware that this, I mean, main thing is to address it to the people. Because, you know, for example, we have tried to lock down, put curfews and all sorts of quarantines and all that in trying to prevent the epidemic from spreading. Of course, there are failures at some point, but what is more important is that the people suddenly learned that, and then maybe private institutions or NGOs that deal with that, but not necessarily government itself. So I think it's important that what we are doing here is we are giving a hand to the people who are who can reproduce what they study, not for logical thinking. We don't have anything called logical thinking in our curriculum, which we need to do. I mean, whole system has to change. I know it's not going to change overnight, but I think somebody has to start somewhere. So I think first step would be to educate the public. Educate the public through maybe paid advertisements, maybe whatever, little snippets, or maybe social media messages that could reach viral levels, or Facebook, whatever, about how to deal with your child during the lockdown. So I think these are critical issues that we need to address. And there has to be responsible people who decide on this. I mean, I'm a retired university teacher, but I don't have the resources nor have the power to do any of those things. But we can be think tanks. That's a different zone. But we are not. We are now sort of basically discarded in a way. So, so I think it's important that this sort of thinking processes have to come. And some of the people who are presently in the university system, like Professor Vasanta, you know, they should be able to initiate a dialogue with the Ministry of Education and develop a system where public education on matters of the psychological aspects of this. I mean, of course, during the Child Protection Authority time, we did do some things on educating people on child abuse and made people aware of child abuse. And the time when everybody thought corporal punishment was the correct thing, we were able to change that modus of thinking, and everybody thought child servants are normal. We were able to change that, but then it has to be through state. NGO cannot do that. But of course, maybe you can get other people, like, for example, the UN can be involved to some extent, but I don't know how far. But then UN also has to have a state partner. So the state partner should be able to understand what we are talking about. So I'm sorry, I can't give a magic bullet to it. Even whether, I think the immediate issue is making parents aware of the issues concerned in the psychology of children, and to prevent exploitation and abuse of children in this whole process. I mean, for example, when we give priority in opening bars, I'm sorry, I'm not being critical of a government as such, but what I'm trying to say is we give priority to open bars, maybe for economic reasons, but then we are promoting child abuse. We are promoting domestic violence. I'm sorry to be controversial in this issue. I don't think it's controversial in a way, because most of the people on the webinar would be able to. I mean, we can't sanction child abuse or domestic violence, because we know the relationship between alcohol and domestic violence, alcohol and child abuse, and dysfunctional families, right? So I think the government has to come to some sort of a compromise. If they don't have the expertise, I mean, there are plenty of experts willing to help. It's nothing political. It is for the people of the country. Sorry for being.
No, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your extensive, very in-depth response to this question. And also there is one question is talking, they're asking about social development of children who are in the early childhood, because that's affected or influenced by this COVID-19. How their social development is going to be built when it is with this lockdown or the schools are reopened. So
I think what is very important to realize is that it is the childhood brain that is very malleable. It is like a piece of clay. You can make it in any way that you want. You can. So basically, I think I don't want to go into medical details. It's the hypothalamic and the amygdala which plays a very important role in the psychological development of an adult and from childhood experience. For example, a child who is sexually abused or physically abused would tend to become an abuser during adult life. How does that happen? You suffer in your childhood, but then you become a similar abuser. So that is because of the impact on an immature brain, especially the what we call the primitive brain or the reptilian brain or amygdala hypothalamus axis. So I think even things like racism, right, is something that is put into brains of children in early childhood. So we have to understand that trauma, violence, everything revolves around that. So I think it is important, crucial that children of this age, these children who are should be in preschool or early school, primary level, that should not be traumatized. On one hand, there may be a bit of a blessing in disguise, and that is the rush and the pressure of children to go from one tuition class to another may be reduced. In a way, it may be a blessing in disguise, the pressure on the child, right? A child who's in grade 4 having to rush from one tuition class to another and all that, that is less. But, and I believe that that is not going to have a huge impact on the education. But at the same time, I think what is needed is that reduce trauma to a child as much as possible, whether it's emotional trauma, physical trauma, sexual trauma, right? It's important because it is the emotional trauma which is most important. Because you physically abuse a child, the bones will break, but it will heal. But it is the emotional impact which is important. You sexually abuse a child, the wounds will heal, but not the wounds inside the brain. And then an abuser, a sexually abused boy would be more prone to be sexually abusive as an adult. A sexually abused girl may be even abusive sometimes, but also more promiscuous in other ways. So there's a lot of research on this. I don't have to do that. So it is the childhood trauma that has to stop. And that is the message that has to go to the crowd. Now, of course, not only childhood, going up to the teenage years, the youth years, right? So I think now, for example, if we talk about, when you talk about, let's say, child soldiers, right? We don't see that anymore. When you talk about child soldiers, they were more effective as soldiers than adult soldiers. Why? Because their mind and that tiny brain was more malleable to be molded, and what we used to be calling brainwashed. I don't think it's that can be groomed in certain ways, right? So that was also trauma to the child having to face armed conflict. So I think there are many issues like that. I think it will take hours to discuss this, but the baseline is to prevent trauma during childhood and teenage years. Then, if they're traumatized, the counseling is what is important. the resources for counseling has to be developed and has to be addressed and recognized as important. So, but we as a country, for various reasons, uh, sometimes due to territorial reasons, uh, sometimes doctors don't want non-doctors to be recognized as specialists. For example, psychologists. I don't know exactly how it is and where it is, but these are issues which get into professional territories. That's why I don't want to get into the professional territory of a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I am talking just in terms of from a point of view of a pediatrician who has experience in the child abuse arena. So again, these are very important areas where people don't want other people to come in. So it's a human weakness anyway.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your excellent explanation and in-depth ideas what you shared. So now we are coming to the end of the program. Now this opportunity for the speakers to conclude the session. The today's session was on basically impact of pandemic on children's education. So therefore, what the way forward? So the way forward, we talk about different stakeholders, or all the stakeholders have the responsibility, obligation towards the protection of our future generation in terms of their psychological and other resources and other responsibilities. So now this time for the concluding remarks from the speakers. So we are giving a few minutes to both speakers. Ms. Milani, you can start your conclusion in few minutes, and thereafter Professor Harendra will end the session. Thank you. Now over to you, Ms. Milani.
Professor, thank you for that very detailed presentation that you made also. Very simply concluding remarks are that we as adult citizens need to take on responsibility, A, for the safety of our children, and B, for their education. And to create that pressure for government, like Professor said, it's difficult as a part of a civil society organization. Also, it is difficult, except for the knowledge we have. I mean, we are always willing to share the knowledge we have. We are willing to work towards a better safety network and towards better lives for our children, and that is what we can do, and that is what every adult citizen of Sri Lanka need to take on that responsibility to create that safety network for our children. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Harendra, it's now over to you.
Yeah, I think, yeah, sorry. I think what's important here is that what we need to do is to make awareness, make the people aware of the issues concerned, and then not necessarily we should call it, for example, the responsibility of the government or whatever. Government has certain responsibilities, they have too many responsibilities maybe, but maybe put some pressure or advise government to change the way in thinking where we are not necessarily catering to the so-called best children, the people who are first all the time, right? Personal anecdote is that I was never first in class. I never carried away a prize in school, right? I was a late developer, right? So if I was downgraded at that point, right, I don't know where I would be. So I think there are lots of people who cannot make it through exams sometimes, right? Okay. I had no problems with exams, but anyway, there are children who are very intelligent. For example, Bill Gates never passed his college entrance exam or didn't continue college, right? and Einstein was removed from his school, right? So you can't judge people like that, you know. Of course, there are very intelligent people who do very well right throughout. Again, it depends on whether you are going for repetition of education or read something and put it out like a parrot, or are we thinking about logical education and so on and so forth. So I think we need a system change in terms of logical education in this country. We need the parents to be aware of all those issues. We need the parents to be aware of the disabilities in children, certain difficulties in reading and writing, right? You know, dyslexia is so common that those children get beaten every day in school because normally he's a very rational, very nice child who understands a lot of children. But when it comes to reading, he can't read. When it comes to writing, he can't write. So the teacher can't understand. I mean, teachers also have to be educated in the latest systems of these things. And I think that medical people and some of the psychological people know that bit, but there is a gap between the formal education system and that thing. So I mean, people who have failed in medical education to enter medical school in Sri Lanka, who have gone abroad and qualified, are super consultants in Sri Lanka, back again here. So there was some problem there. They failed the entrance exams, A-levels here, but they have gone abroad and done very well, and they are super class consultants, not only in Sri Lanka, but all over the world. So I mean, our system of education is wrong in many ways, right? Of course, although we have a high literacy mindset, right? So that's a different story. So I think the baseline, bottom line is to educate. If you can't educate the authorities to change the system, we can directly educate certainly government media, but to other media sessions like this, maybe some of the television stations may want this type of dialogue. Some papers may want this type of dialogue. Their purpose and their objective may be different, but they may want that dialogue. So that dialogue has to be open, and that education is not necessarily reading and writing, and that there can be severe psychological issues concerning some of these things, and also to address issues of children who have disabilities in the learning and learning. Sort of sums up a little bit of what I said.
Thank you, sir. That's end of our webinar. It is my obligation to conclude the session formally. Gratitude to Professor Harendra Vidyajyothi, Professor Harendra De Silva. During your leisure time and your peaceful retirement, you spent very good evening with us, and you shared in-depth aspects of this health and mental issues of the children during this pandemic situation, how it's affecting the education. Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation and sharing your thoughts and sharing your views with us. It's very useful, and we still think about how, as a stakeholder, we can contribute in order to develop our children. And our next speaker, Ms. Melanie Salpetikurulla. So thank you, ma'am, for accepting our invitation and participating in this event and sharing your real world experience with us. It is really enriching our resources and our thoughts and our ideas. So we wish you all the best. Your organization, the Child Protection Force, to grow more and more. And we also there, we can collaborate with you in the future. We can work with you in your projects and activities. And also CSHR door is open for you all. Please, we are there to support you in terms of education and research activities. Thank you, madam, for accepting our invitation and sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. Then our director, Professor Vasantha Sadiratna, she was with us and she happened to go for another webinar, another overseas webinar. Therefore, she couldn't be till the end of our program. So we express our gratitude to our team leader, Professor Vasantha Sadiratna. She has been a pillar of strength throughout all our activities. Finally, our participants. So because of your strength, your support and accepting our invitation and taking the extra effort to fill our Google form and participating in our events and continue to be in our patron list and participate in our future events. Our 30th anniversary has more and more events in the future. Please be in our Facebook page and our other social media network, and also follow our educational program awareness campaign. And finally, our team, the CSHR team and CSHR technical, CSHR administrative and other support staff. Thank you so much, the team, for your commitment and contribution towards the successful completion of this webinar. And finally, our children, our future, our responsibility. So enlightenment, awareness, it is the shared responsibility of our all stakeholders. So we wish healthy body in healthy mind in every child in the future. Thank you so much. With this remark, I conclude this webinar. Thank you. Good night. God bless you all. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.